The river was not supposed to be the enemy. Yet on that blistering ancient afternoon, as the sun hammered down on bronze helmets and dust-coated shields, the soldiers realized the truth. The river was the final guardian of the world they needed to conquer. Its surface looked calm, almost mockingly gentle, but beneath that glassy skin ran a current so violent it could snap an ox cart in half. The water hissed against the banks, swollen from late rains, swirling like something alive. Thousands of men stood frozen before it, separated from safety, victory, and destiny by a strip of nature that refused to bend. The general, weather-worn, unflinching, a man who had survived battles that became legends, stared at the raging water and whispered words that would echo across thousands of years. If land denies us a road, then the water will carry one. No one understood what he meant. Not yet. But this moment, this exact heartbeat in history, was where one of humanity's greatest engineering secrets began. Not a weapon, not a machine of war, but something stranger, quieter, and far more important. A bridge that could float. A road made of wood, rope, leather, and raw brilliance, laid not on stone or soil, but on the restless back of a river. What the soldiers didn't know was that ancient civilizations had been fighting this same battle for centuries. Rivers were the original fortresses of nature, shifting, unpredictable, impossible to command. They could trap armies, divide kingdoms, redirect trade, or drown a campaign before the first spear was even thrown.
To cross them quickly, safely, and with an entire army, that was a challenge worthy of the boldest minds in history. A challenge that turned ordinary craftsmen into miracle makers. This is the story of those miracle makers. The forgotten engineers who tamed water with nothing but intellect, improvisation, and the kind of courage usually reserved for the front lines of battle. They didn't build monuments. They didn't carve their names into marble. They didn't sculpt statues that would stand for 1,000 years. Instead, they built something far more fragile, structures never meant to last more than a few days. Bridges that floated, bridges that changed history, bridges that made rivers surrender. But to understand how they did it, to understand how ancient engineers solved the problem that even modern armies wrestle with, you need to travel back. Long before Rome marched across Europe, before Persia linked continents, before Greek fleets battled on sun-sparkled seas. This journey begins with a single question. How do you build a road on something that never stops moving? Before we dive into Egyptian ingenuity, Assyrian innovation, Persian daring, Greek adaptation, Roman precision, and Chinese mastery, let's pause for a moment. Because if you're fascinated by the genius of ancient engineering, by the way forgotten technologies still shape the modern world, then you're in the right place. Welcome to the next chapter of our Ancient Tech Stories series, where we take you inside the minds of engineers who lived centuries before blueprints, mathematics textbooks, or computer models. Where every episode uncovers the mysteries behind inventions we've forgotten, but the ancient world mastered. If you're new here, thank you for joining us on this journey. And if you love stories about how ancient people created mind-bending technology, Technology that still baffles experts today, then please consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow, helps us bring you bigger stories, and keeps this kind of long-form historical exploration alive. And now, if you're ready, let's walk back to that riverbank.
The soldiers still stand frozen. The sun still blazes. The current still roars. The general raises his hand, not to order a retreat, not to command the building of rafts or ferries or boats, but to summon the engineers. These men carried no shields, no swords. Their calices came not from battle, but from tools, saws, chisels, axes, hammers. They studied rivers the way priests studied omens. To them, water wasn't the enemy, it was a problem, and problems could be solved. The general points to the churning water. "Make me a road," he says, and the engineers bow, not out of fear, but out of pride. Because this is what they were born for. For moments everyone else called impossible. They begin taking measurements, pacing the banks, watching the movement of foam to judge the speed of the current, throwing weighted ropes to measure depth, checking the angle of the sun to calculate how long they have before darkness traps them on the wrong side. Their minds race faster than the river. They study the piles of lumber the soldiers lugged from camp. They inspect the coils of rope, stiff but strong. They examine the leather skins sewn airtight for storing precious water on marches. And one engineer, older than the rest, runs his palm across the wood and smiles the faintest smile. "We have everything we need," he says. "But," one of the younger men begins, "the water is too strong. Even boats would—" "Not boats," the old engineer interrupts. "A road." He explains that the river's own strength can be used against itself, that wood floats because water refuses to crush it, that ropes bind not by resisting force, but by redirecting it, that the river can be tricked, guided, tamed, if you understand its moods. His voice carries across the bank, steady as a drumbeat. Water does not yield, but it does support. The general watches, silent, as the engineers begin their work. Logs are shaped into long frames. Ropes are twisted into thicker, stronger cords. Skins are inflated with lung-burning effort until they bulge like round, leathery suns. Soldiers see the pieces and still don't understand. How could something like this, wood, rope, and air, carry an army? But the engineers do understand, because they've seen it done. Egyptians did it first. Assyrians refined it. Persians proved it could win wars. Greeks improved its flexibility. Romans mastered its speed. Chinese engineers perfected its endurance. And now this army, this day, this river will join that lineage. The old engineer turns to the general and says, "When we're finished, you will walk across the water." The general says nothing. He only nods. And so the river becomes a workshop, a laboratory, a challenge waiting to be solved. As the sun sinks lower and shadows stretch across the banks, the first floating platform is slipped into the water. It bobs,
tilts, steadies. More platforms follow, each joined to the next with interlocking timber and rope that creaks under the strain but holds firm. Slowly, impossibly, a road begins to appear on the shifting back of the river. Not a bridge built over water, but a bridge built on water.
By dawn, the floating spine stretches from one shore toward the other, still incomplete but undeniably real. A road born out of nothing but human will. When the first soldier steps onto it, the entire army holds its breath. The wood sinks an inch, and no further. The soldier takes another step, then another. A cheer erupts behind him, raw, triumphant, disbelieving. The river has been defeated. Not with steel or fire or force, but with knowledge, with engineering. And this is only the beginning. If you've enjoyed this opening chapter, this glimpse into how humanity first challenged nature's most unpredictable barrier, then make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss Chapter 2, where we travel to ancient Egypt and witness the birth of the world's first floating crossings. Because rivers did not yield easily, and ancient engineers were only just getting started. Before the Persians changed ships across the Hellespont, before Roman engineers stitched entire rivers together with timber and iron, before Chinese dynasties shaped floating highways that lasted for generations, there were the Egyptians, a civilization carved from desert and sunlight, whose survival depended on the Nile's moods. A civilization that measured time with shadows, built monuments with geometry, and farmed a landscape reborn each year under a flood. They lived because of the river. They traveled because of the river. They traded, fought, prayed, and prospered because of the river. So it should come as no surprise that the world's first experiments with floating bridges began here, on the soft, fertile banks of the Nile, where ancient engineers learned to read the water like priests reading sacred texts. But to understand their breakthrough, we must start with a disaster. It happened during the reign of a minor pharaoh whose name never survived the centuries, lost to sand, wind, and time. But his problem became unforgettable. A large detachment of workers and soldiers needed to cross the Nile during a flood season that came earlier than expected. The waters rose higher than any living person had seen. Entire villages were swallowed, trees were uprooted. The river became a roaring brown monster, swirling with debris and the wreckage of washed-away farms. The crossing point, normally shallow enough for oxen, was now hundreds of feet wide, deep and violent. Boats were available, yes, but not enough for a mass crossing. And the pharaoh's overseers needed to move an entire construction crew to the western bank, where limestone quarries waited. The building of a temple could not pause. Royal order demanded progress, even if nature disagreed. The overseer, a stern man named Amos, paced along the riverbank with a frown carved as sharply as any hieroglyph. He had workers, tools, ropes, timber, but no time. And then he heard laughter. Not cruel laughter, not mocking laughter, but the laughter of curiosity. A small group of young laborers, barefoot, bronze-skinned, and sunburnt, were shoving a cluster of cut logs into the water. The logs bobbed, rolled, then settled together, nudging like friendly creatures. One boy climbed atop them, nearly falling off at first, then finding balance. The logs dipped. But they did not sink.
Amos marched over with anger ready on his tongue, but the moment he saw the logs floating, something in his mind shifted. It was as if a door opened inside him, revealing a room he didn't know existed. He dismissed the boys and called for the engineers. Egyptian engineers were not like the military teams of later empires. They were priests of measurement, mathematicians of mud and stone. They built granaries shaped to hold heat, canals shaped to borrow water, and pyramids shaped to defy eternity. When Amos showed them the logs, they didn't laugh, they didn't frown, they simply observed. One engineer, a woman named Seshat-Nefru, named for the goddess of knowledge, knelt beside the water and placed her palm against a log's wet surface. "It floats because the river accepts it," she said softly. To her, the logs were not toys. They were potential. She gave orders immediately. Bring more logs, bind them, test them, measure their capacity, measure their strength, and most importantly, measure the river. Because the Nile was not just rising, it was angry. For 3 days, the team labored. Workers dragged entire trunks from storage. Rope braiders twisted papyrus fibers into thick cords. Engineers carved notches into the logs so they interlocked like puzzle pieces. By the end of the 3rd day, a raft the size of a small hut floated near the bank, steady, resilient, alive. But Amos needed more than a raft. He needed a road across the river. Seshat-Nefru watched the river for a long time that evening. She traced the patterns of the foam, studied the rhythm of the currents, and listened to the deep, distant hum of water hitting stone. She understood 2 truths. First, the Nile was too strong for one long structure. Second, the answer lay in breaking the impossible into smaller pieces. Floating platforms, short ones, fast to build, easy to replace, flexible enough to move with the river instead of resisting it. Her voice carried across the camp as she announced her plan. "We will build many rafts and make the river hold them together." The workers exchanged confused glances. They understood rafts, they understood boats, but a series of floating platforms connected by rope and planks? That idea was as strange as building a staircase into the sky. But Seshat-Nefru was not finished. "We will not fight the Nile," she said. "We will work with it. Let the water carry our weight. Let the current guide the line of our crossing." She put a finger to her temple. "A bridge need not be stiff if the river is strong enough to support it." Amos was skeptical, but he trusted her. She was the kind of engineer whose ideas seemed outrageous at first, until they worked. The first modular platforms took shape over several days. Each one was made of logs bound tightly with papyrus rope, reinforced with wooden beams, and topped with woven mats to create a flat walking surface. Workers tested each platform near the shore. They wobbled, dipped, and creaked like old boats, yet they held. The challenge came with anchoring. The Nile did not sit still. The Nile lunged, pulled, twisted. If the platforms weren't anchored correctly, the entire chain would drift like a snake caught in a storm.
Egyptologists tried stones first. The river laughed and rolled them away. They tried burying weights in the mud. The current ripped them loose. They tried embedding wooden stakes on the banks. Some held, but many snapped. Then Seshat-Nefru ordered something unexpected. "Bring out the sandbags." Workers looked at her as if she'd gone mad. Sandbags were used for construction, not river taming. But she explained her reasoning. Stone fights the river. Mud fights the river. Stakes fight the river. But sand flows like water, and water accepts what behaves like itself. It was genius. Sandbags settled into the riverbed, reshaping themselves into stable anchors the water could not uproot. They absorbed the current instead of resisting it. Once dozens were placed in staggered formation beneath the platforms, the floating chain held firm. By the 10th day, a series of rafts stretched out into the Nile like stepping stones made of wood and air. Workers crossed first. Their feet wobbled. Some laughed in amazement. Some held ropes for balance, but all reached the far side safely. Then came the real test. Oxen, carts, tools, and dozens of men carrying heavy limestone blocks. The platforms dipped dangerously, ropes groaned in protest, water splashed across the edges, but the bridge held. For the first time in recorded human history, long before empires perfected the craft, a floating bridge carried more than people. It carried purpose. Amos crossed last, his sandals wet, his heart pounding. When he reached the western bank, he turned back toward Seshop-Nefru and raised his hands to the sky. "You have made the river our servant," he said. She bowed her head. "No," she replied. "We simply learned its language." The floating bridge did not last long. It was never meant to. The Nile reclaimed it after a few weeks, swallowing logs, ropes, and sandbags alike.
But its legacy traveled, in letters carved onto clay tablets, in stories told by merchants, in whispers exchanged between foreign boatmen. Egypt had done the impossible, created a road that floated, a crossing shaped by observation, improvisation, and respect for the river. This early, fragile, brilliant experiment would later inspire civilizations across the Middle East. Assyrians would inflate animal skins, Persians would refine anchoring methods, Greeks would perfect stability, Romans would optimize speed, China would master longevity. But in the beginning, on a muddy Nile bank, with young workers, braided ropes, and drifting logs, a floating bridge was born. And history had moved one step closer to conquering rivers forever. Long after the Egyptians first coaxed a bridge from the Nile's patient waters, a new power arose in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, one not known for patience, but for precision, discipline, and ferocity. The Assyrian Empire did not simply meet challenges, it crushed them. Its armies marched farther, faster, and with more brutal efficiency than any before them. But even the fiercest empire found itself humbled by nature.
The Tigris had flooded. Not the slow, predictable flood of the Nile, but a violent surge, brown, churning, furious. Trees spun like toys in the current. Whole sections of farmland had vanished beneath boiling water. The river seemed to stretch endlessly from horizon to horizon, its banks swallowed, its depth unknowable. And on the eastern shore stood an Assyrian army, armored, disciplined, ready for war, utterly trapped. The king's campaign depended on crossing this monster. Delay meant disaster. Supplies were finite. Morale was fragile. Enemies on the far side of the river were preparing their defenses even as the Assyrians waited helplessly. Yet in that moment of crisis, the king did not summon his generals. He summoned the engineers. Assyrian engineers were a class apart. Mathematicians, artisans, craftsmen, and problem-solvers raised within an empire that tolerated no excuses. They built siege engines that shattered stone walls, waterworks that rivaled later Roman ingenuity, and machines so fearsome that enemy scribes described them as demons of wood. But on this day, the engineers were asked for something stranger, something that did not require timber or metal, but air. The leader of the engineering corps was a quiet man named Nabuna. He was not tall. His robe was not richly dyed. He carried no sword. Yet when he approached the riverbank, the soldiers stepped aside with more respect than they gave their generals. Nabuna studied the Tigris with eyes that had measured 1,000 currents. He watched the foam swirl. He watched logs spin and vanish. He watched the pull of the deep channel where the water ran black and furious. Then he said something so absurd that the soldiers laughed. "We will float across on the skins of animals." The laughter died quickly when they realized he was serious. Nabuna explained, not with arrogance, but with the calm certainty of a man who had already imagined the solution long before others understood the problem. The idea was deceptively simple. A hollow object floats. If inflated with air, it floats even better. And if you bind many floating things together, they become a platform, a bridge. The Egyptians used logs, but logs were heavy. Logs required forests. Logs had to be shaped, carved, and transported. The Assyrians needed something portable, something soldiers could carry across deserts and mountains, something light enough for speed, but strong enough for war.
Animal skins. Thick, durable, waterproof skins, especially from goats, could be sewn shut, tied with pitch-sealed seams, and inflated like balloons. And so, for the first time in military history, an army prepared to cross a raging river on what would become the world's first inflatable bridge. The engineers ordered workers to bring the hides, hundreds of them, goats, cattle, sheep, any skin that could hold air. Women skilled in leatherwork were summoned to sew the seams. Boys were sent running for the pitch pots, heated over fires until they bubbled like molten black honey. The sewing process was delicate. A single flaw meant a deadly collapse. Needles pierced thick hide with rhythmic precision. Leather cords tightened, pulled, wrapped. Hands smeared pitch into seams until they gleamed in the sunlight. Inflation began at sunrise. Workers blew into the skins until their cheeks ached, their lungs burned, and veins stood out on their necks. Skins expanded, first sagging, then swelling, then turning bright and taut under the desert sun. Each one became a living buoy, straining against its bindings as if eager to test the river. A soldier timidly pressed one with his foot. It bounced back, almost mockingly. Nabu-Napanai oversaw the entire operation, tightening knots, inspecting seams, rejecting any skin with the slightest imperfection. By midday, a sea of inflated skins, round, bulging, surprisingly sturdy, covered the riverbank like an army of swollen leather suns. Now came the assembly. This was the Assyrians' true brilliance. Each inflated skin was tied beneath a wooden frame, forming a pontoon unit. These frames were then linked together with ropes, thick, triple-braided ropes that had survived campaigns longer than most soldiers. More frames were added. More skins were bound beneath them. Slowly,
Platform by platform, a floating line stretched across the water. It was not rigid, it swayed.
It bobbed. It groaned. It looked absurd, like a giant chain of leather bladders barely holding up a wooden walkway. But it worked. The first engineer to step onto the structure bounced slightly, as though walking on a gigantic drum. The platform dipped, rose, dipped again, but stayed afloat. Then came the real test. A pack mule loaded with sacks of grain. The mule hesitated at the edge. Its ears twitched. Its hooves clattered nervously. Finally, after much coaxing, the animal stepped onto the first platform. The skins dipped dangerously, but recovered. The mule made it to the second platform, then the third, then the center of the river. A cheer erupted on both shores. The inflatable bridge held. Nabunai allowed himself a rare smile. "This river," he whispered to himself, "has met its match." But the crossing was not without danger. The Tigris growled beneath them. The current smashed debris into the pontoons. A broken tree trunk clipped the side of the bridge, tearing one skin open. Air hissed out. The pontoons sagged. Yet even then, the Assyrians were ready. Replacement skins, lighter than wood, easier to carry, were swapped in minutes. The bridge shuddered, stabilized, and held. By dusk, the entire army had crossed. Soldiers, carts, supplies, horses, pack animals, even siege specialists, carrying the blueprints of machines that would soon thunder at foreign walls. On the far side, the king approached Nabuna, this quiet engineer whose mind had saved the campaign. "You defied a river," the king said. Nabuna bowed. "No, my lord, we borrowed its strength." Because that was the genius of the Assyrian method. Instead of building against the water, they built with it. Air and skin were flexible. They absorbed the current instead of fighting it. The bridge could rise, fall, and bend without breaking. It was the beginning of a new chapter in military engineering. An army no longer needed forests to cross rivers, no longer needed weeks to build rafts, no longer needed to pray that the waters would calm. They carried their bridge on their backs. Decades later, Greek historians wrote in awe of the strange Assyrian crossing, where men walked upon the backs of inflated animals as if upon the river itself. Persian kings adopted the design. Even the Chinese, centuries later, used versions strikingly similar in structure and purpose. But it was the Assyrians who took the first daring leap, who trusted air more than wood, skins more than stone, ingenuity more than tradition. Standing on the far bank of the Tigris, Nabuna watched as the last rays of the sun painted the water red and gold. Soldiers celebrated behind him. Horses drank from the river. Camps were built. Fires crackled. The king's campaign would continue, because an engineer had once looked at a river and seen not an obstacle, but a possibility. The sea was angry that morning. Angry in a way only the Aegean could be, with winds that shriek like ancient gods and waves that rose like mountains. But it wasn't the sea's fury that concerned the soldiers gathered along the narrow shores of the Hellespont. It was the command, whispered throughout the Persian camp, from generals to foot soldiers, from scribes to sailors. The great king will walk across the sea. Xerxes I, lord of the vast Persian Empire, ruler of lands stretching from Egypt to India, had set his will upon Greece.
His army was the largest the ancient world had ever seen. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers, horses, archers, engineers, servants, and a supply chain so massive it seemed to remake the earth itself wherever it passed. But even the largest army in history could not defeat water. The Hellespont was a narrow strait, deceptively slim, separating Asia from Europe. But narrow did not mean gentle. Its currents pulled like invisible hands. Its winds changed direction without warning. Ships attempting to cross were often carried sideways, spun, or smashed against rocks. To get his army into Greece, Xerxes needed more than boats. He needed a road across the sea. And so he summoned the finest engineers in his empire, Egyptian builders fluent in the secrets of the Nile, Phoenician sailors who knew the Mediterranean's moods, Lydian craftsmen with skills whispered about in markets and temples alike. Yet even they hesitated when they saw the strait.
Xerxes did not. "Build me a bridge," he ordered. "A bridge over the waters." The engineers bowed. They had no choice. Disobedience meant death. Failure meant something worse. Humiliation in front of the king whose ambition reached beyond the horizon. Their first attempt was bold, but flawed. Hundreds of ships, large and small, were tied together, side by side, forming a floating platform. Ropes stretched from one shore to the other. Wooden planks were laid across the decks. Soldiers tested it. The bridge rocked, but held. Then the storm came. Winds howled like wolves. Currents twisted like serpents. Waves rose like the fists of Poseidon himself. When the sun rose the next morning, the engineers found nothing but shattered timbers and drifting wreckage. Their magnificent floating bridge had been swallowed whole. The Persians whispered that even nature feared Xerxes' wrath, and so the sea destroyed the bridge before he could cross it. But Xerxes did not blame the sea. He blamed the builders. His anger was legendary. A king who commanded nations could not tolerate defiance from anything, not from people, not from empires, not from nature. The story goes that in a moment of fury, Xerxes ordered the waters of the Hellespont to be whipped, cursed, and branded with hot iron, as if punishing a disobedient servant. Whether this story is literal or symbolic, no one truly knows. But we know what came next. He ordered a new bridge, a better one, a stronger one, one that even storms could not tear apart. The engineers, humbled and terrified, returned to their calculations. And from that fear, brilliance emerged. Their new design changed everything.
Instead of using one type of ship, they combined ships of different sizes, heavy war galleys to fight the current, smaller vessels to add flexibility, and sturdy transports to bear weight. They anchored the ships at angles rather than straight lines, allowing the current to flow through the gaps instead of smashing into a solid wall. But the true innovation was in the binding. The ropes used before had been thick. Now they were monstrous. These new ropes were woven from flax and papyrus, each one thick as a man's thigh, pulled taut by teams of oxen until they hummed like plucked strings. The engineers drove massive anchors deep into the seabed, weighting the bridge down with stones so enormous that dozens of men strained to lift them. The ships, once aligned and stabilized, were lashed together with such precision that they became a single organism, a floating creature of wood and rope strong enough to defy the sea's tantrums. As the bridge took shape, soldiers stood in awe. It stretched across the Hellespont like a wooden horizon, a spine of ships built upon the waves. Planks were laid over the decks, then covered with soil to create a solid walking surface. Either side was lined with high walls so that horses wouldn't panic at the sight of water beneath their hooves. A floating road that looked like land. When it was done, Xerxes stepped onto the bridge first. Not a soldier, not a general, not a priest. The great king alone. His robes glittered. His crown caught the sunlight. His steps echoed across the planks with a sound that carried all the way to the opposite shore. Behind him marched the army. Tens of thousands of men. Carts, war horses, supplies, weapons, drummers pounding triumph into the air. The bridge held as if carved from the earth itself. Travelers watching from distant cliffs described the scene as a river of men flowing across a river of water. Some said it was the day Persia conquered the sea. Others whispered that the gods were silent, not out of approval, but shock, because no one had ever seen anything like it. Yet the crossing was not just a triumph of size. It was a triumph of engineering mastery. Every detail, every anchor, every rope, every angled ship was a lesson in understanding the moods of nature. The Persians had done what the Egyptians attempted and the Assyrians refined. They built a floating bridge that did not fight the water, but partnered with it. The angled ships cut the current. The giant ropes absorbed the strain. The anchors gripped the seabed like iron claws. The soil-covered planks turned shifting waves into something familiar, a road. The bridge stood for 7 days and 7 nights, long enough for the entire Persian army to pour into Europe. When the last soldier crossed, the engineers stood at the water's edge, exhausted but proud. They had created something beyond even their own imaginations. And as the massive army marched on toward Greece, the bridge remained behind, a silent witness to one of humanity's boldest acts of engineering. It was not magic. It was not the command of gods. It was calculation, observation, and unrelenting human will. Xerxes' bridge became the stuff of legend. Greek historians marveled at it. Later empires studied it, and modern engineers still cite its principles when designing military pontoons and flexible floating structures. But on that day, as the sun set behind the cliffs and the wind died down, it was simply a victory of mind over nature. The great king had crossed the sea, and the world would never be the same.
The Persians had crossed the Hellespont, and the world trembled. Xerxes' massive army spilled into Greece like a tide of iron and leather, and word of his floating bridge spread faster than his soldiers could march. Farmers whispered it. Merchants repeated it. Sailors swore they had seen it with their own eyes, a bridge that stretched across the sea, a miracle of wood and rope that defied the waves. To many, it seemed like an act of divine power. To the Greeks, it was a challenge. In Athens, the city's agora buzzed with arguments. Philosophers debated fate. Politicians debated strategy. But in a small workshop near the harbor of Piraeus, a group of shipwrights and engineers debated something far more practical. How do we answer a bridge that weighs as much as an army? The man leading the discussion was Themistocles, not the philosopher, not the general, but the schemer, a thinker who saw war not as muscle against muscle, but mind against mind. He knew the Persians had size, numbers, wealth, and resources beyond imagining,
But the Greeks had something else: speed, ingenuity, knowledge of the sea. And so, instead of trying to imitate Persia's giant floating structure, Themistocles pushed for something radically different. A bridge must not be heavy, he said. It must move with the water. It must bend with the wind. It must live as the sea lives. Greek engineers listened, not with fear, but with excitement. They were sailors, islanders, craftsmen born beside the water. No civilization understood the moods of the Aegean as intimately as they did.
The Persians had built a bridge to conquer nature. The Greeks would build one to cooperate with it. The first prototypes appeared within weeks. Unlike the massive, multi-deck Persian pontoons, Greek pontoons were small, almost delicate. Each platform was made of interlocking planks shaped with fine joinery. Instead of large, heavy ropes, they used narrow cords woven from linen and goat hair, which did not rot quickly in salt water. Each platform was like a floating tile, light enough for 2 men to carry, sturdy enough to support soldiers, and flexible enough to rise and fall with even the gentlest wave. Themistocles watched the tests from the shore. A young engineer named Lysagoras pushed one of the platforms into the water. It drifted, bobbed, then steadied. Another platform was pushed beside it. The currents tugged them in different directions, until the engineers tied them with a loose, clever knot that allowed a few inches of play. "That knot," Themistocles said, "will save more Greeks than any spear." Because the Greeks understood what Xerxes' engineers had feared. A rigid structure in a shifting sea is doomed. A flexible structure survives. The Greek designs did not resist the water, they adapted to it. The platforms were linked like a chain of dancing figures, never still, always adjusting, their movements small but synchronized, like the breathing of a living creature. Soldiers who stepped onto the early models reported a strange sensation. The bridge seemed to move with them, not against them. Word spread quickly. Soon, islands that had once watched Persia's bridge in terror began to whisper about the Greek response.
A bridge that floated on the sea, but weighed almost nothing. It was not perfect, of course. Greek bridges were not meant for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They were built for speed, quick crossings, rapid deployment, surprise maneuvers. The Greek commanders saw the strategic potential immediately. Imagine an army appearing where the enemy thought water would stop them. Imagine hoplites marching out from behind a rocky cape where no ships were in sight. Imagine a coastal raid executed before the defenders even reached their spears. This was how the Greeks thought, not in grand monuments of engineering, but in sharp, tactical tools. Themistocles pushed the concept further. During training exercises, he ordered hoplites to run across the pontoons in full armor, bronze breastplates, shields, and spears. The bridges dipped violently under the weight. Some soldiers fell into the water, but each failure taught the engineers something. They adjusted the spacing. They angled the pontoons. They strengthened the joints. They replaced wooden pegs with bronze fasteners that locked the planks without adding unnecessary weight. Soon the soldiers were crossing with confidence, fast, sure-footed, and nearly silent. Greek bridges didn't creak like Persian ones. They whispered across the water like shadows. Even the famous trireme captains took notice. These were men accustomed to reading the wind and current like letters on a scroll. When they tested the bridges, they were astonished by how quickly they could be deployed from ship decks. In battle,
Speed was everything, and the Greek pontoons could be assembled faster than any known floating structure. The true test came during a coastal campaign near the island of Samos. Themistocles ordered a surprise landing on a beach the Persians considered impossible to reach without sailing directly into their waiting fleet. Instead of attacking at sea, where Persia held overwhelming superiority, the Greeks approached at night. The engineers worked in silence, hands guided by moonlight. They lowered pontoons into the water under the shadows of cliffs. They linked them quietly with their flexible knots. They extended the bridge until it touched the sand of the forbidden shore.
Greek marines advanced across it like phantoms. By the time the Persian sentries realized what had happened, Greek hoplites were already forming ranks behind their lines. The skirmish that followed was brief, decisive, and humiliating for the enemy. Themistocles' light floating bridge became legendary. Persian commanders found themselves confused. They had expected massive floating structures, the kind that took weeks to assemble and required armies to protect them. Instead, the Greeks used bridges that could be built in hours, deployed from ships, and removed just as quickly. Like everything in Greek warfare, these bridges were tools, not symbols. They were designed for quick strikes, rapid marches, and clever tricks. They were the perfect counter to Persians' monumental engineering. Years later, historians wrote that the Greeks answered the giant with the dancer. Where the Persians built strength, the Greeks built agility. Where the Persians commanded nature, the Greeks negotiated with it. Where the Persians anchored, the Greeks adapted. That was the essence of Greek engineering. Never static, never rigid, always in service of strategy. In the decades that followed, Greek floating bridges became essential to campaigns across island chains, coastal territories, and narrow straits. They allowed armies to outmaneuver foes, strike where least expected, and retreat before the enemy could respond. Even Alexander the Great, who grew up hearing stories of Themistocles' brilliance, employed Greek-style pontoons in his campaigns across Asia. Though his empire was vast, his methods still echoed the innovations born in that small Athenian workshop. The Greek engineers did not leave behind massive monuments like Xerxes, but they left ideas that traveled, evolved, and endured. The sea did not frighten them. The sea inspired them. And on the restless waters of the Aegean, where winds shift like whispers and islands rise like stepping stones, the Greeks proved something profound. Sometimes the lightest bridge is the strongest weapon.
Dawn broke like a blade of gold across the Rhine. Mist floated over the water in ribbons, twisting and curling around the river as if trying to hide it from the world. The Roman soldiers standing on the eastern bank shifted uneasily. They were victorious, hardened, and disciplined, but even they felt a quiet dread. The Rhine was wide, the Rhine was deep, and the tribes waiting beyond it were watching. But Julius Caesar, standing at the edge of the water with his cloak billowing in the cold wind, wasn't staring at the river. He was staring at history, and he was thinking of something no Roman general had ever dared. He was thinking of building a bridge. Not someday, not in months, not even in weeks. He planned to build a bridge today. Across a river so powerful that even the tribes feared it. Across a river the Germans believed was protected by sacred spirits. Across a river that would make any other army wait for ferries, rafts, or the mercy of the current. Caesar didn't want mercy. He wanted proof. Proof that Rome did not yield to nature.
But unlike Xerxes, who built his floating bridge to move an army, Caesar's bridge wasn't about need. It was about message. A message that Rome could walk wherever it wished. A message that distance meant nothing. A message that no river could protect Rome's enemies. The soldiers beside him did not yet understand, but the engineers did. Roman engineers were not glamorous. They wore no shining armor, they rarely appeared in the stories told by poets. Yet they were the quiet spine of the empire, the people who made Rome not just powerful, but inevitable.
They were the ones who built roads that outlasted empires, aqueducts that crossed valleys like giant stone feathers, and siege engines that shattered worlds. So when Caesar said, "We will build a bridge," they saluted as if he'd given the most ordinary order. Because to them, the extraordinary was ordinary. The engineers spread out along the riverbank, taking measurements with ropes, weighted lines, and clever sighting tools. They mapped the depth. They mapped the current. They selected the strongest timber from the nearby forests, straight, thick beams from trees that had been growing long before Rome existed. Then, Caesar gave the order that stunned even his veterans. Build it out from the bank, not on the water. It seemed impossible. A floating bridge could be assembled in parts, like the Persians and Greeks did. But Caesar didn't want a floating bridge. He wanted a solid one. A bridge that did not sway. A bridge that did not bend. A bridge that stood like Rome, unyielding, eternal, inevitable. The engineers nodded, already racing through calculations. They drove immense wooden piles into the riverbed, using iron-tipped rams that swung from cranes mounted on platforms. The water roared around them, trying to erase their work, but the piles went deeper, 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 until they reached the river's bones. Each pair of piles leaned toward each other, forming a V-shape pointing upstream. This brilliant design made the river push the piles together instead of apart. More piles leaned downstream, locking the structure into a stubborn, immovable skeleton.
The soldiers watched in awe. The bridge was not floating. The bridge was not trembling. The bridge was rooting itself into the river like a living thing. Caesar himself walked among the workers, checking every joint, every rope, every iron clamp. He asked questions, not out of doubt, but out of hunger. He wanted to understand every piece of the miracle he was commanding. Once the support skeleton was finished, the Romans added beams, thick, flat, carefully aligned. They laid planks over the beams. They reinforced the planks with cross beams, so tightly wedged that they needed no nails. The river surged beneath them, but the structure didn't move. The soldiers began to realize they were watching something impossible. A bridge was rising in a place where no bridge had any right to exist. And it was rising fast. Too fast. The German tribes across the river panicked. Scouting parties came close enough to see the construction and fled. Word spread like fire. Rome is building a road on the river itself. They will cross without boats. They will be upon us in hours. By nightfall, the German camps were in chaos. By morning, many had retreated deep into the forests. But Caesar wasn't finished. He ordered the engineers to build protective structures upstream, pile barriers designed to break away logs or debris that might be sent downriver to smash the bridge. The Germans did try to sabotage it. Logs roared down the river like dark missiles, but they struck the barriers, not the bridge. The Romans stood unmoved.
On the 10th day,
10 days to build a bridge across the Rhine. Caesar stepped onto his creation. The bridge didn't sway. The bridge didn't groan. The bridge held beneath him as if it had been carved from stone. Behind him marched the legions, armor gleaming, shields locked, sandals slapping the timbers in perfect rhythm. Even the war horses crossed without fear. When the last soldier reached the opposite shore, Caesar ordered a full march into German lands, not to conquer territory, but to show he could. Rome walked where Rome wanted. After 18 days of demonstrating Roman supremacy, Caesar returned to the river. He gave an order that shocked the engineers. "Take it down." The soldiers looked at him, confused, but the engineers understood. The bridge had served its purpose. It had delivered its message. And Caesar wanted the land to remember the sight of a structure so magnificent, and to remember the power of the man who could erase it just as easily. The engineers dismantled the bridge, leaving the river unchanged. But the tribes who watched, hidden among trees, trembling in silence, would never forget. They had witnessed a miracle, not of gods, not of magic, but of human will and Roman precision. Rome did not build the biggest floating bridges, nor the most flexible, nor the most elegant. Rome built the most effective ones. Bridges assembled with terrifying efficiency. Bridges designed with military purpose. Bridges that turned rivers, once lines of protection, into meaningless lines on a map.
From the Tiber to the Danube, from the Rhine to Britain's wild rivers, Roman engineers left behind structures that inspired awe for centuries. Their bridges didn't just connect land, they connected Rome to victory. And as the Rhine flowed quietly again, reclaiming the space where Caesar's bridge had stood, the world understood something profound. A floating bridge was genius. A flexible bridge was clever. But a Roman bridge, fast, precise, unstoppable, was fate. The river curled like a silver dragon through the valley, wide and serene on the surface, but with a hidden strength that had humbled armies for centuries. Morning mist drifted over the water in pale curtains, and the first rays of the sun touched the distant hills with gold. Merchants, soldiers, and travelers gathered on the banks, staring at something that seemed to defy both nature and time. A bridge, yet not a bridge of stone. A road, yet not a road of earth. A structure that rose and fell with the breath of the river itself. It was the pride of the Song dynasty, a floating bridge longer than any the world had seen. But to understand how China mastered the art of floating bridges, you must journey back far before this moment, back to the Tang dynasty, when war, trade, and the need for connection demanded something new. China was a civilization of rivers. The Yangtze flowed like a muscular beast through the heart of the land. The Yellow River, wild and unpredictable, was both creator and destroyer. Smaller tributaries crisscrossed the landscape like veins, feeding cities, farms, and armies. Rivers were lifelines. Rivers were barriers. Rivers were opportunities waiting for the mind of an engineer.
For centuries, Chinese builders had understood how to tame water. Their canals transformed the country's economy, moving grain from south to north on the Grand Canal, a waterway so vast it dwarfed every other engineering achievement of the ancient world. But one empire in particular, the mighty Song, became obsessed with bridging rivers faster, building crossings stronger, and creating structures more durable than any before. It began in a time of crisis. An invading army had approached one of the Song heartland cities, moving quickly across the plains. A river separated the attackers from their target, but the Song generals knew better than to rely on water alone. They had seen too many enemies adapt, innovate, and find ways across. They needed a bridge that could be built faster than the enemy's advance. They needed something that did not require months of stonework or mountains of timber. They needed something that could move with the river's moods. So the engineers turned their eyes to the floating bridge. Floating bridges were not unknown in China. Records from earlier dynasties describe structures made of boats tied together, used temporarily during war or for seasonal festivals. But the Song dynasty wanted more than a temporary bridge. They wanted a permanent one.
And so, at a fortified river city whose name has been lost to time, but whose legend endures, the Song engineers gathered on a foggy morning much like this one. Their leader was a man named Li Chong, a quiet, thoughtful engineer whose mind was a palace of geometry and flowing water. He studied the river with patient eyes. He marked its currents, its shallow and deep sections, its turbulent swirls and its still pools. Behind him, soldiers hammered stakes into the ground, tying ropes to the shore. Merchants watched anxiously. City officials muttered prayers, unsure whether to hope for a miracle or simply brace for defeat. Li Chong simply nodded and said, "We will use the river's own strength." And thus began China's ascent into floating bridge mastery. The Song engineers used a method unlike anything the world had seen. Instead of building a temporary line of boats, they built a series of massive wooden pontoons, huge platforms with flat bottoms, reinforced with iron plates to resist wear and impact. These pontoons were shaped more like barges than rafts, wide and stable, designed to hold not dozens of people, but hundreds, along with carts, horses, and even wagons. Each pontoon is anchored with enormous iron chains thicker than a man's wrist. These chains ran from the pontoons to the riverbanks and into the river itself, dropping down to gigantic stone blocks that had been carved and lowered underwater with almost supernatural precision. But the true genius of the design lay not in the pontoons or the chains, but in the spacing. Li Chong ordered every pontoon to be placed slightly apart, leaving just enough room for the river to breathe between them. The currents rushed through the gaps, reducing pressure. The bridge did not resist the water, it yielded. The pontoons rose and fell with the river's pulse, each one moving independently but remaining part of the whole.
It was a structure that lived. The planks laid across these pontoons were wide, smooth, and arranged with interlocking joints. No nails were needed. Everything fit together like the pieces of a giant wooden puzzle. The bridge stretched across the river in a flowing curve, not a straight line. A curve calculated to distribute tension evenly, minimizing stress on any single section. When the first test crossing began, people held their breath. A cart loaded with grain creaked forward. The wheels rolled onto the planks. The bridge dipped slightly and steadied. A second cart followed, then soldiers, then horses. The entire structure swayed gently like a cradle rocked by the water. Then it held. The crowd erupted in cheers. But this was only the beginning. A few years later, a new version emerged, the Tuanzhou floating bridge, known in legends as One-On Bridge, meaning 10,000-piece bridge. It spanned the wide, restless waters of a southern river, linking bustling ports and markets. It used stone piers and wooden pontoons in a hybrid design that amazed even foreign travelers. Some sailors wrote that they had never seen a bridge that could survive storms. Others described how the pontoons were hauled aside during typhoons to prevent damage, then reattached with iron rings once the danger passed.
It was a floating bridge with the durability of stone and the flexibility of wood. That was the Chinese philosophy,
blend strength with adaptability. Centuries later, the Ming dynasty carried the tradition forward. They created military pontoon systems so quick to deploy that generals boasted of crossing entire rivers in the time it took to cook a pot of rice. Their pontoons were reinforced with lacquer to prevent rot. Their chains were forged with heat treatments that gave them both strength and elasticity. During one campaign, a Ming commander ordered a floating bridge constructed overnight across a swollen river. When dawn rose, two armies stared in disbelief. The bridge stretched from bank to bank as if it had always been there. The soldiers marched across it, the water swirling below, but the bridge held steady. By the Qing dynasty, the Chinese floating bridge had become iconic. Every major city had one, some temporary, some permanent. Travelers described walking across these floating roads while feeling the subtle movement of the water beneath them. It was like walking on the river's skin. The bridges were decorated with lanterns during festivals, glowing like chains of fire across the water. At night, they reflected on the river's surface, creating the illusion of a golden path leading into another world. Foreign envoys and merchants from Arabia, Persia, and Southeast Asia wrote about these marvels in their journals. They carried stories of China's floating bridges across oceans, stunned that any civilization could build such structures not only for war, but for everyday life.
Because this was the difference between China and the rest of the ancient world. Other civilizations built floating bridges in moments of desperation. China built them because they understood water. They embraced the river's rhythms. They studied storms. They measured currents with the precision of astronomers tracing stars. And in doing so, they created floating bridges that were not temporary feats, but enduring marvels. Back on the Songor Bridge, the sun was now high in the sky. Merchants crossed with their wares. Soldiers marched in tight formation. Farmers pushed carts filled with vegetables. Children ran and laughed, listening to the hollow echo of their footsteps. The bridge swayed softly, gently, almost lovingly, never fighting the river, always dancing with it. Li Chong stood at the water's edge, watching his creation. He did not smile outwardly, Song engineers rarely did, but his eyes shone with quiet pride. We have given the river a road, and the river has accepted it. The dragon of water had been tamed, not with force, but with harmony. And the world would be changed forever.
The river was calm that morning, a mirror of silver stretching between two quiet shores. Not a ripple disturbed its surface, not a whisper of wind dared to play with it. It looked peaceful, gentle even. But every engineer who had ever worked beside such a river knew the truth. The calm ones were the most dangerous. A quiet river could turn furious in minutes. A silent current could hide a violent undertow. A glassy surface could conceal a depth that swallowed whole trees. And yet, throughout the ancient world, engineers dared to lay bridges on these shifting waters, not with metal hulls or modern flotation devices, but with materials that, by every reasonable measure, should have sunk like stones. Wood too heavy, rope too weak, leather too fragile, reeds too soft, and sometimes materials so strange that modern scientists still raise their eyebrows. And yet, they floated. They endured. They carried armies, wagons, cattle, and empires across rivers that had crushed lesser attempts. How?
To answer that question, you must walk into the minds of ancient engineers, not with the tools of a modern builder, but with the instincts of people who tested the world with their hands, eyes, and intuition. They didn't have physics equations. They didn't have buoyancy formulas. They didn't write dissertations on tensile strength.
They watched. They experimented. They listened to the rivers. And through this, they learned to select materials not by what they looked like, but by what they could become. The first mystery material was wood, specifically the densest wood they could find. Modern people tend to think of wood as lightweight, but ancient engineers knew better. They knew some wood was so heavy it almost sank. These dense timbers made the best pontoons because they resisted splitting, bending, and swelling. Oak, cypress, teak, larch, cedar, each one carried unique strengths that only years of handling could reveal. Egyptians discovered early on that if you lashed dense logs together, they didn't just float, they floated predictably. Predictability, to an ancient engineer, was more valuable than lightness. A raft that behaved the same way every day, even when soaked in water, was worth more than a boat that floated high but changed with temperature and moisture. Then there were the reeds. Reeds were never meant to hold armies. They were thin, brittle, and hollow. A child could snap one between two fingers. And yet the people of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Persia wove them into thick mats, folded them into tubes, tied them into bundles, and suddenly they were buoyant, strong, shock-absorbent. A single reed could do nothing. 1,000 reeds? They could carry a cart. Engineers in ancient China studied bamboo in the same way. Bamboo was already miraculous, tall as a tower, strong as bone, flexible as rope, and naturally hollow. A bundle of bamboo tubes was basically a ready-made pontoon courtesy of nature herself.
When tied tightly together, bamboo pontoons could hold incredible weight while barely touching the water's surface. Soldiers crossing such bridges described a strange sensation, feeling almost as though they were walking on air. But for true ingenuity, nothing surpassed the use of animal skins. To the Assyrians, the world's first inflatable bridge builders, dried hides were more than byproducts of hunting. They were miracle membranes. Stitched with tendon and sealed with pitch, they could hold vast amounts of air. And air was the greatest flotation material ever discovered by humankind. Air weighs nothing. Air resists sinking. Air, when trapped inside a strong enough shell, becomes strength itself. Engineers inflated skins not with crude bellows, but with human lungs, warm breath sealing life into each sphere. As the skins expanded, they tightened, stretching into powerful bladders capable of lifting loads that no log could manage. They tied dozens under a single frame, creating a cluster of invisible forces working together to defy gravity. It was the first time humans truly harnessed pressure as a building material. Even stranger were materials used by cultures we barely hear about. Nomadic tribes along Central Asian rivers filled leather bags not with air, but with sheep's wool. Wool trapped pockets of oxygen, giving the bag buoyancy. Wool also absorbed water slowly, preventing sudden failures. It was a floating cushion that grew stronger as it compacted.
In India, early texts describe the use of earthen jars, large clay vessels sealed shut and tied beneath wooden frames. Clay doesn't float, of course, but the trapped air inside did. These jars acted like ancient, fragile pontoons. If one broke, another took its place. Engineers carried them like cargo and assembled bridges wherever needed. And then there were the metals. Yes, metals. In China's later dynasties, blacksmiths produced iron-studded pontoons. Not iron hulls, but wooden pontoons reinforced with iron plates. The iron gave weight, stability, and durability. It stopped sharp rocks, storm debris, and even the tips of enemy spears. If a pontoon cracked, the iron plating held it together long enough for repairs. How did they keep these heavy materials afloat? By careful balance. Ancient engineers didn't just toss materials together. They calculated, not with numbers, but with instinct, how much weight a pontoon could bear before sinking. They arranged heavier materials low and lighter materials high. They distributed load evenly across platforms. They tested again, and learned that floating bridges succeed not because one material is perfect, but because every material carries part of the burden. Consider the ropes. Rope is the unsung hero of every floating bridge in history. Without rope, wood would scatter, skins would drift away, bamboo would twist, clay jars would smash. But ancient ropes were not delicate threads, they were masterpieces. Egyptian papyrus ropes were woven so tightly they could rival modern hemp. Persian flax ropes could withstand years of tension. Chinese silk ropes, contrary to popular belief, were not decorative. They were strong, flexible, and surprisingly resistant to water when properly treated. Rope was the skeleton. Pontoons were the organs. Planks were the skin. Together they formed a living creature, a bridge that rose and fell, strained and relaxed, held firm and shifted, all according to the river's breathing. But understanding the materials was only half the battle. The real magic lay in how ancient engineers used movement. Modern builders try to eliminate movement in bridges. Ancient engineers embraced it. They expected their bridges to wobble, to dip, to sway, to creak. They built not for perfect stability, but for controlled instability. A floating bridge wasn't meant to feel like the earth. It was meant to feel like water. The challenge was keeping that movement from reaching catastrophic levels. So, they learned secrets that modern engineers still study. Spread weight across many pontoons. Tie platforms with flexible joints. Leave gaps to relieve pressure. Angle pontoons to deflect currents. Use heavy anchors for storms. Use light anchors for calm days. Replace damaged modules without dismantling the whole bridge. In short, they mastered modular design long before the term existed. As rivers rose during flood seasons, floating bridges rose with them. As they fell, the bridges sank, softly, gently, without cracking or collapsing. A stone bridge fears change. A floating bridge thrives in it. That was the wisdom of ancient engineers. They took wood, rope, skin, reeds, clay, and bamboo, materials that should have failed, and wove them into structures that lasted years, decades, sometimes centuries. And under the feet of emperors, generals, merchants, caravans, entire armies, these impossible materials worked together in perfect harmony. A harmony born not from advanced tools, but from patient observation, fearless experimentation, and a profound respect for the rivers that shaped their world. What came next were the trials, the storms, the floods, the sabotage that tested every principle engineers had learned. Rivers were powerful, but so too were the minds that dared to cross them. The rain began as a whisper, small droplets tapping against the wooden planks of the bridge. Soldiers looked up, uninterested at first. Rain meant discomfort, nothing more. But within minutes, the whisper transformed into a roar. The river stirred, the sky darkened, and soon the floating bridge beneath their feet began to sway in a way no engineer ever wanted to feel. The river was waking. This was the side of floating bridges the ancient world rarely immortalized in poems or carvings. The part where nature pushed back. The part where water reminded humanity that no matter the ingenuity of men, rivers had been shaping earth long before tools or mathematics existed. Storms, floods, sabotage, currents that twisted like serpents, logs launched like missiles, waves that rose like the crests of wild horses. Floating bridges might rise and fall with the water, but that did not make them invincible. And those who built them knew that true engineering did not lie in construction, but survival. Far upstream, the storm unleashed its weight across the mountains. What began as gentle rain became torrents of water that crashed down slopes, swelling tributaries, feeding the main river like a beast being force-fed until it grew uncontrollable. The current thickened, darkened, and accelerated. Soldiers on the bridge gripped the ropes as the pontoons shuddered. The engineers rushed forward, faces pale. They knew what was coming. The first impact arrived without warning. A broken tree trunk, massive, ancient, gnarled, came hurtling around the bend like a battering ram. The river spun it sideways, then slammed it into the outer pontoons. The bridge groaned, a creaking, tortured sound that sank into men's bones. The pontoons dipped, rose, shuddered, but they held. This was why Chinese, Persian, and Greek engineers angled their pontoons, why Assyrians used flexible joints, why Roman engineers built protective upstream barriers. Rivers had moods, violent moods, and only a bridge that anticipated those moods could survive.
But storms were merely nature's assault. Humans were far worse. In nearly every ancient war involving rivers, floating bridges became targets. If you couldn't defeat an enemy on the battlefield, you could drown them on their march. Generals understood that cutting the line between banks could end a campaign, isolate an army, or force retreat. And so sabotage became an art. The most common method was simple: send debris downriver. Logs, tree trunks, or bundles of thorny branches were released upstream and allowed to drift into the bridge. If the enemy's engineers were unprepared, the debris could wedge between pontoons, increase pressure, or push the entire structure sideways. Some armies used fire. Oil-soaked bundles were lit and cast into the water, drifting like floating comets. Soldiers on the bridge panicked as flames licked the wood, smoke thickened, and heat radiated beneath their feet. The only defense was speed. Cut loose the burning section before the fire could spread. Others used stealth. Spies swam under cover of darkness, knives clenched between their teeth, slicing at ropes and anchor lines. A single cut at the wrong point could send part of the bridge adrift, collapsing it like a row of dominoes. Engineers knew this. They planned for this. They built redundancy: multiple ropes, layered knots, backup pontoons, anchors spaced at intervals. No bridge relied on one lifeline. But storms combined with sabotage? That was the nightmare. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the soldiers' faces in ghostly flashes. Wind tore across the river, flattening waves only to raise them again moments later. The water surged higher, pounding against the pontoons like fists. Engineers shouted orders, their voices swallowed by thunder.
Reinforce the anchor line. Tighten the eastern ropes. Shift weight to the center. They ran, slipping, drenched, hands raw and bleeding as they hauled ropes thicker than their arms. Soldiers who had never held a hammer found themselves pounding stakes into muddy banks. The bridge heaved, The water roared louder, and then another impact. This time, not a fallen tree. This time, a boat. A small enemy craft, loaded with rocks to make it heavy, drifting rapidly toward the bridge. The soldiers shouted warnings. Arrows flew, but the current was too strong to stop it. The boat smashed into the central pontoon, the sound exploding like bone snapping. The pontoon dipped dangerously. For a heartbeat, the bridge hung between survival and collapse. Ropes stretched so tightly they sang. Planks bowed beneath the weight. The river pulled, twisted, demanded surrender. And yet, again, the bridge held. Not because it was rigid, but because it was flexible. The pontoon moved with the strike instead of resisting it. The ropes absorbed tension like tendons in a living body. The anchors strained but did not rip free. The engineers, soaked to their bones, watched as the structure stabilized, slowly, gently, like an animal shaking off the pain of a blow. This was the forgotten brilliance of floating bridges. They survived not by being stronger, but by being wiser. Rigid things break. Flexible things endure. But the storm was not done. Hours passed. The river climbed. The sky remained a churning slate of thunder and darkness. The engineers knew that if the water rose just a little more, the pontoons could be driven into submerged obstacles or smashed against unexpected whirlpools.
They needed to adapt, fast. Working through the night, they cut loose several upstream pontoons, allowing the river to swallow them as decoys. This lightened pressure on the remaining structure. They shifted planks inward, creating a narrower but safer walkway. They drove additional stakes into the shore, tying emergency ropes that snaked across the mud like gigantic spider webs. As the river swelled, the bridge transformed, shrinking, twisting, bending, changing, always staying one step ahead of disaster. By dawn, the storm finally broke. The clouds thinned. The thunder faded into distant murmurs. The rain softened to a drizzle. The river, still angry but tired, slowed its assault. Soldiers collapsed in exhaustion. Engineers sank to their knees. The bridge lay battered, soaked, warped, but alive. And as the sun rose, its golden light revealed the truth. The bridge had survived because ancient engineers did not fear movement. They studied it. They harnessed it. They respected the unpredictable nature of water and built structures that behaved like water. Fluid, adaptable, always shifting. Bridges became warriors. The river became the battlefield. And engineers became generals in their own right. Storms would come again. Saboteurs would return. Rivers would continue their endless, untamed rage. But floating bridges, humble, flexible, underestimated, would continue to defy them. Because while stone bridges cracked and broke, floating bridges learned. They learned to breathe with the river, to bend with the wind, to yield without failing, to survive what rigid structures could not. And in the long saga of ancient engineering, there was no truer lesson. Strength is not in resistance, but in resilience. The wind that morning was sharp enough to cut. It sliced across the valley, rattling the branches of pine trees and sending crows wheeling overhead. Below, the river churned in broad, dark coils, an ancient serpent twisting between the cliffs. Its waters hid secrets, whirlpools, shifting boulders, treacherous stones. For centuries, this river had protected one side of the world from the other. The battle lines were clear. 2 armies, 2 ambitions, 1 river between them. But today, something impossible stood above the water. A floating bridge. Not a temporary sketch of rope and timber. Not a desperate line of lashed boats, but a structure so daring, so precise, that soldiers on both banks whispered it must be magic. This is the story of a bridge that changed an empire. A bridge built not for pride or spectacle, but for survival. It happened during the Warring States period of ancient China, an age of relentless conflict, shifting alliances, and ruthless strategy. Among the many kingdoms vying for dominance, the state of Qin stood out, not for its size, but for its ambition. Qin was a land of iron discipline, tireless farmers, and commanders who studied war the way priests studied scripture. Yet even they were humbled by rivers. The Wei River, broad, unpredictable, and prone to sudden floods, stood as Qin's greatest obstacle. Their enemies, the Wei kingdom, controlled the far bank and believed the river made them untouchable.
Qin armies tried to cross by ferry, by rafts, by swimming horses, but each attempt ended with men swept away or cut down midstream.
But in Qin's capital, a young strategist named Zhang Liang believed the river could be conquered, not by muscle, but by mind. Zhang was not a warrior. He was quiet, almost delicate in appearance, with ink-stained sleeves and a mind always turning. While generals paced war rooms, Zhang wandered riverbanks. While others devised attacks, he studied currents. And one winter morning, he returned to the Qin court with a strange proposal. "Do not cross the river," he told the king. "Make the river carry us." The court erupted in confusion, but Zhang continued, unfolding a scroll covered in sketches of planks, pontoons, iron hooks, and angled mooring lines. "We build a bridge," he said, "a floating bridge, not for merchants, not for travelers, for war." At first, the general scoffed. A floating bridge was unstable, they said, fragile, easily destroyed. But Zhang shook his head. "That is true of simple bridges," he replied. "What I propose is not simple." He explained his idea with the calmness of a man who had already seen it built. Pontoons spaced like stepping stones to guide the river's force. Anchors arranged in a triangle pattern to pull the bridge taut. Iron rings to allow sections to flex without breaking. A curved shape, not straight, to absorb pressure. And most importantly, a modular design that allowed any damaged piece to be replaced instantly. No ancient army had ever attempted such a structure. But Qin listened, because Zhang was rarely wrong.
The king gave approval. The engineers were summoned. The race against time began. Winter was fading, and with spring came the river's fury. The construction had to be completed before the meltwaters descended from the mountains. Men worked day and night. At dawn, smoke rose from timber yards as carpenters shaped pontoons. By midday, ironworkers hammered rings until sparks filled the air. At night, soldiers by torchlight braided ropes as thick as a man's arm. Zhang himself walked the riverbank at all hours, calculating, adjusting, correcting. He challenged the engineers constantly. What happens if the current shifts? What if the river rises 2 more feet? What if the enemy sends fire rafts? What if debris strikes the pontoons? His mind hunted every possible failure before the river could deliver it. And then, before sunrise one cold morning, it was done. The floating bridge stretched across the way like a glistening spine of dark wood and iron. The Qin army prepared to cross. On the opposite shore, the Wei soldiers laughed. They mocked the bridge, calling it a toy. They said the river would swallow it before noon. They pointed at the rising waters upstream, certain they would win not by sword, but by nature. But Zhang Liang had not underestimated the river. When the waters surged, the bridge bent, softly, gracefully, absorbing the force like a bowstring. The pontoons dipped, but did not fail. The anchors held fast. The iron rings flexed instead of snapping. And the Qin soldiers marched.
Step by step, row by row, shields gleaming, spears steady. It was a sight the Wei had never dreamed possible. An army walking across a river as if across the earth itself. Wei commanders panicked. They ordered fireboats into the water. Flaming rafts, dripping with oil, floated downstream like burning beasts. But the bridge's curved shape diverted them. Soldiers stood ready with wet cloths and hooks, pulling away danger before flames could catch. Next, Wei archers unleashed volleys. Arrows rained, shields lifted, the bridge endured. Wei cavalry charged the bank, but Qin's vanguard met them before they reached the landing. Blades clashed, the river roared, the floating bridge swayed but remained unbroken. By noon, half the Qin army had crossed. By evening, they had taken the far shore. By night, the Wei defenses collapsed. The impossible had happened. A floating bridge had turned defeat into victory. A strategist's idea had shifted the balance of war. A river that once protected an empire now delivered its doom. The Wei king fled. The Qin banners rose. And among the soldiers celebrating on the shore, Zhang Liang stood quietly, watching the river flow beneath the bridge he had imagined long before it existed. He did not smile. He rarely did. But he whispered softly, "Rivers are not barriers. They are paths. We only need to learn how to walk upon them." The bridge remained for weeks after the battle, sturdy, living, rising and falling with the water like the chest of a sleeping giant. Merchants crossed it, messengers raced across. Children from nearby villages ventured onto it, laughing as it bounced beneath their feet.
And then, one morning, just as Caesar would do many centuries later in Rome, the Qin dismantled it. Not because it had failed, but because it had served its purpose. It had delivered a victory. It had rewritten a border. It had altered the scale of power between nations. But the memory of it, the floating road that defied a river, did not fade. For generations, strategists studied Shangliang's design. Engineers copied its curvature, its anchoring system, its modular joints. Even the first emperor of a unified China, Qin Shi Huang, praised the brilliance of the bridge that helped bring unity one step closer.
The river returned to its calm, the valley to its silence, the world to its politics and wars. But history remembered. Because sometimes an empire isn't changed by a battle, a king, or a sword, but by a bridge. A floating bridge, built at the right moment, by the right mind, with the right courage. And on that day beside the Wei River, a young strategist proved something eternal. That the greatest victories belong not just to the strongest armies, but to the boldest engineers. The river was quiet that day. Not silent, rivers are never silent, but calm, as if resting. The water drifted past in long, graceful ribbons, reflecting a sky of pale blue and thin clouds. On the shore, a group of modern engineers stood with helmets under their arms, studying the floating bridge stretched before them.
Steel frames, rubber pontoons, cable tensioners gleaming in the sunlight. A perfect choreography of modular components, assembled in hours, ready to carry military vehicles across to the far bank. But beneath the steel and hydraulic clamps, beneath the digital sensors and tightly wound cables, something much older lived in the bones of the structure. One of the engineers, a gray-haired veteran with deep-set eyes, tapped the pontoon with his boot and said quietly, "Funny, isn't it? We think we're advanced, but this is a conversation we've been having for thousands of years." The younger engineers looked confused, and so he told them a story. He told them about Egyptian workers tying logs into rafts under a rising Nile, about Assyrian soldiers blowing air into animal skins until they bulged like living hearts, about Persian shipmasters lashing hundreds of vessels into a road across the sea, about Greek craftsmen weaving speed into flexibility, about Roman engineers stabbing the riverbed with iron-tipped piles like spears against nature, about Chinese masters balancing wood and water with the precision of calligraphy, about strategists who turned floating bridges into weapons, tools, and symbols that shaped the fate of nations.
He did not quote textbooks. He did not cite formulas. He spoke as if he had walked those riverbanks himself, watched those storms, touched those ancient ropes with his own hands. Because in a way, he had. Every modern engineer has heritage in their craft, a lineage of minds that solved the same problems with different tools. A river is still a river. A current is still a current. Water has not forgotten how to move, and so the lessons of ancient engineers still matter. Take buoyancy. Modern materials, rubberized pontoons filled with air, plastic composites, sealed steel drums, operate on the exact same principle an Assyrian leather skin did. Air floats. Contain it well enough, and you can carry armies. Take modular design. Today's military bridges are built in sections, clipped together like puzzle pieces, just as Roman, Greek, and Chinese engineers created platforms that could be swapped, shifted, or replaced in minutes. Take anchors. Modern floating bridges rely on anchors designed to hold against dynamic forces, wind, current, load, just as Persian engineers once set triangular mooring lines to resist the Aegean's fury. Take flexibility. Modern collapsible pontoons absorb shock from waves and vehicle weight, the same concept that allowed Changliang's bridge to survive a surge of the Wei River 2,000 years ago.
Even the curved shape of certain modern modular bridges echoes ancient Chinese philosophy. A curve distributes force. A curve rides the current. A curve lives longer. But the greatest legacy is something deeper.
something that cannot be measured in tensile strength or buoyancy coefficients. It is the idea that engineering is not a battle against nature, but a negotiation. Rivers are not conquered, they are engaged, listened to, respected. Ancient engineers learned this through trial, failure, and persistence. They built bridges that danced with water, not against it. They understood storms as teachers, currents as collaborators, and materials as companions. Their bridges were alive, structures that moved and breathed. Modern engineers, with all their machines and software, still kneel before rivers to listen. The gray-haired engineer walked onto the modern floating bridge, boots thudding softly on the metal planks. His younger colleagues followed. The bridge shifted gently beneath their weight, rising and falling in a slow rhythm. "You feel that?" The youngest nodded. "It's alive." "Yes," the elder said, "because it has to be." He told them how centuries-old Chinese bridges were built with enough flexibility that they could rise multiple meters during floods without breaking. He told them that Roman engineers built upstream barriers to deflect logs, ideas still used in flood-prone crossings. He told them how Greek pontoons were designed for speed, mirrored now in rapid deployment bridges that unfold like metallic wings from military vehicles. Then he looked across the river and added, "And every time someone walks across one of these, they're walking on history."
The wind picked up, rippling the river's surface. The bridge swayed slightly, its motion smooth and predictable. The engineers paused, appreciating the subtle movement. "People think innovation is new," the elder continued, "but innovation is remembering. Remembering what works, what doesn't, what nature punishes, what nature permits." A silence settled over the group as they contemplated the truth of it. The river murmured below them. The bridge breathed. The sky grew brighter. And the narrative began to peel back the centuries, revealing unexpected parallels. During World War II, Allied forces used floating bridges almost identical in concept to Roman designs. Heavy, modular pontoons anchored upstream, layered with planks, pushing toward the far shore as armies advanced across Europe. In the modern world, after tsunamis or hurricanes destroy permanent bridges, emergency teams deploy temporary floating versions, descendants of Egyptian rafts and Assyrian skins. Some cities build floating pedestrian paths for festivals. Fishermen in remote villages assemble floating walkways from plastic barrels. Engineers design hybrid pontoon bridges inspired by Song Dynasty prototypes. Everywhere, ancient wisdom breathes inside modern creation. But perhaps the most remarkable echo is this: floating bridges, ancient or modern, are built not just for travel, but for connection. They are symbols of unity, of ambition, of the human need to cross from here to there.
Rivers divide, bridges heal, and floating bridges, more than any other kind, embody the idea that even the most unstable foundation can support a journey if the design is right. As the engineers continued inspecting their modern bridge, the elder paused at the midpoint. He placed a hand on the railing and looked down at the swirling water beneath. "Sometimes I wonder," he said quietly, "if those ancient builders knew that one day their ideas would cross oceans and millennia." A young engineer smiled. "They didn't need to know. They built well. That's enough." The elder nodded, A slow, thoughtful gesture. Yes, he agreed. That's enough. The sun climbed higher, warming the metal beneath their feet. Somewhere far downstream, the river widened toward the horizon, where countless bridges, old, new, remembered, forgotten, had crossed its surface. The floating bridge before them, modern yet ancient in spirit, stood as both a tool and a monument. Not a monument of stone or glory, but of continuity, proof that human ingenuity flows like the rivers it seeks to cross, winding through centuries, cutting through obstacles, always moving forward. And as the engineers walked back to the shore, their boots echoing on the planks, the river whispered its eternal reminder. What is built with respect endures. What is built with understanding survives. What is built with imagination changes the world. Just as it always has. Just as it always will. Because the legacy of floating bridges is not simply a chapter in history. It is the river itself, carrying the ingenuity of ancient hands into the future, one current at a time.